He walked into his own bank, dressed in simple clothes. No suit, no watch, just a man blending in. But within minutes, the staff looked right through him, ignored his questions, whispered behind his back, and treated him like he didn't even exist. They thought he was nobody. But here's the twist. They didn't realize he owned the bank. When he finally revealed who he was, their faces, you wouldn't believe it. But that wasn't the worst part, because what he did next changed everything. Ever been judged unfairly? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear your story. His name was Jamal Thompson. To the world, he was a successful businessman, a self-made millionaire who owned multiple companies, including the very bank he was walking into. But today, he didn't look like a CEO. No tailored suit, no luxury watch. Just a regular guy in jeans, a hoodie, and worn-out sneakers, the kind of man most people wouldn't give a second glance. Then there was Lisa, the branch manager. Sharp suit, sharper attitude. She thrived on authority, loved the sound of her own voice, and believed she could size people up within seconds. If you didn't look like money, you weren't worth her time. And Mark, the teller, young, smug, always eager to impress Lisa. He followed her lead without question, believing that customers in expensive clothes were the only ones who mattered. The bank itself was pristine. Glass walls gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Marble floors reflected the polished shoes of busy professionals, and motivational posters hung on the walls preaching about excellent customer service. But those posters were just decoration, because what really mattered here wasn't service, it was status. Jamal wasn't there to catch anyone slipping. He was just passing through, curious to see how his staff treated people when they thought no one important was watching. That was their first mistake, because the moment they looked past him, dismissing him like he didn't belong, they set the stage for a lesson they'd never forget. Jamal walked into the bank like any regular customer. No fancy entrance, no dramatic flair, just a man with a quiet presence. He stood in line, waiting patiently as a handful of people were ahead of him. The place was buzzing with customers, but something was off. He noticed how the staff treated others. A warm smile for the man in a tailored suit, polite small talk with the woman flashing a designer handbag. But when Jamal's turn came, the energy shifted. Lisa, the branch manager, glanced at him briefly, then looked away like he wasn't even there. No smile, no greeting. Just a dismissive glance before she turned her attention back to her phone. Jamal approached the counter where Mark, the teller, was standing. Mark barely looked up. "Can I help you?" Mark mumbled, his tone flat, eyes glued to the screen in front of him. "Yes," Jamal replied calmly. "I'd like to inquire about opening a new account." Mark sighed, clearly annoyed. "You can find all that information online." Jamal raised an eyebrow. "I'd prefer to speak with someone directly." Mark finally looked up, giving Jamal a quick once-over. The hoodie, the worn sneakers, the casual demeanor. "We're a bit busy today," he said, his voice dripping with disinterest. "Maybe come back when it's not so crowded." Jamal glanced around. There were only a few people waiting, and the other tellers were chatting idly. Busy wasn't the problem. He tried again. "I'm interested in learning about premium accounts. Is there someone who can assist me?" Mark chuckled under his breath. "Premium accounts? Are you sure?" Jamal's face remained calm, but his mind was racing. Is this really how they treat customers? Lisa noticed the exchange and finally decided to step in, not to help, but to reinforce the dismissive attitude. "Sir," she said, approaching with forced politeness, "we offer consultations by appointment only. You'll need to schedule one online." "No exceptions?" Jamal asked, his tone neutral. She gave a tight smile. "Not today." Jamal nodded slowly. "I see." As he turned to leave, Lisa whispered to Mark, loud enough for Jamal to hear, "Some people think walking in with an attitude will get them VIP treatment." Mark laughed softly, shaking his head. Jamal paused at the door, took a deep breath, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek, black key card, one that only executives at the highest level of the company carried. Without a word, he walked past the security desk, straight through a door marked Employees Only. Lisa's eyes widened. "Hey, you can't go back there," she shouted, hurrying after him. But Jamal didn't stop. He walked confidently into the manager's office, sat down behind the desk, and waited. Within seconds, Lisa burst in, her face flushed with anger and confusion. "What do you think you're doing? You can't just—" Jamal held up his hand, cutting her off. "Sit." There was something about his voice, calm, firm, unshakable, that made Lisa hesitate. She sat, her posture stiff, her mind racing to figure out what was happening. Jamal pulled out a folder from the desk drawer, flipping through papers with the company's letterhead. Then he looked up, locking eyes with her. "My name is Jamal Thompson," he said quietly. "I own this bank." Silence. Lisa's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Her face drained of color as the realization sank in. Mark appeared in the doorway, confused. "What's going on?" Jamal didn't even glance at him. "You'll want to come in too." Mark stepped inside, his smug expression fading quickly when he saw Lisa's face. Jamal leaned back in the chair, his fingers steepled together. "I wasn't here for an appointment. I wasn't here for VIP treatment. I was here to see how my staff treats people when they think no one important is watching." Neither Lisa nor Mark spoke. What could they say? Jamal continued, "You both made it very clear who you think deserves respect. And it's not people who look like me." Lisa finally found her voice. "I'm so sorry. We were just busy. It's not what you think." "Oh, it's exactly what I think," Jamal replied calmly. "And now I know." He stood up, gathering the folder in his hands. "There will be a meeting tomorrow. Some of you might not be here for it." With that, he walked out, leaving Lisa and Mark standing in stunned silence, their faces pale with the weight of their mistake. The next morning, the bank was quieter than usual. The same polished floors gleamed. The same motivational posters hung on the walls. But the energy had shifted. Whispers floated through the hallways like invisible threads pulling everyone's attention in the same direction. Lisa sat stiffly at her desk, nervously tapping her pen against a notepad. Mark hovered near the coffee machine, stealing anxious glances toward the conference room where Jamal was scheduled to hold the staff meeting. At exactly 9 a.m., Jamal walked in, not in casual clothes this time, but in a sharp, tailored suit that commanded respect without him having to say a word. His calm, composed demeanor was the same, but there was an edge to it now, a quiet authority that filled the room before he even spoke. The entire staff gathered in the conference room, unsure of what to expect. Some fidgeted in their seats, others tried to act normal, but no one could ignore the tension hanging in the air. Jamal stood at the front, his hands resting lightly on the table. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam his fist. He didn't need to. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady and controlled. "Yesterday, I walked into this bank, my bank, dressed like any other customer. I wasn't here to test anyone. I wasn't looking for trouble. I was simply observing." The room grew still, the weight of his words settling over everyone like a blanket. "What I observed," Jamal continued, "was disappointing." He let the silence stretch for a moment, making sure his words sank in. "I saw a culture where respect is given based on appearances, where people are judged by what they wear, not who they are, where professionalism is reserved for those who look like they deserve it. Jamal's eyes moved slowly around the room, landing briefly on Lisa and Mark, whose faces had gone pale. "Lisa," he said, his tone sharp but not angry, "you're the branch manager. Your job is to lead by example. But yesterday, your example was dismissiveness, arrogance, and bias." Lisa's lips trembled slightly as she tried to speak. "Mr. Thompson, He held up a hand, silencing her. "This isn't about excuses. It's about accountability." Then he turned to Mark. "And you? You followed her lead without question. You laughed when a customer was dismissed. You assumed that someone like me couldn't possibly be important enough to deserve your attention." Mark looked down at the table, his face burning with shame. Jamal paced slowly, his words measured and deliberate. "You see, respect isn't something you give selectively. It's not a currency you spend only on people you think are valuable. Respect should be the foundation of how you treat everyone who walks through those doors." The room remained silent, the tension growing thicker with each passing second. "Now," Jamal continued, stopping at the head of the table, "I'm not here to humiliate anyone. I don't need to. Life has a way of teaching lessons far better than I ever could." He leaned forward slightly, his voice soft but powerful. "But let me be clear, this isn't just about yesterday. It's about what kind of culture we allow to grow in this company. And I won't allow one that thrives on judgment and bias." Jamal straightened up, glancing at Lisa and Mark one last time. "Effective immediately. You're both suspended. We'll be reviewing your conduct and determining whether there's a future for you here." Lisa's eyes welled with tears, her confident facade completely shattered. Mark didn't even try to speak. Jamal turned to the rest of the staff. "For the rest of you, consider this a wake-up call, not just because you saw what happened to them, but because it could have been any of you." He paused, letting that sink in. "Moving forward, there will be mandatory training on customer service, diversity, and bias, not because it's a checkbox, but because it's necessary." With that, he walked out of the room, leaving behind a stunned silence that spoke louder than any applause ever could. Weeks passed after that meeting. The bank wasn't the same, and neither were the people who worked there. Jamal's words had echoed through the halls long after he left the room. Some employees adjusted quickly, realizing the lesson in humility and respect. Others, not so much. Lisa and Mark had been suspended pending review. They thought maybe time would soften the situation, that eventually things would go back to normal. But Jamal had other plans. One morning, the staff received an email, mandatory meeting scheduled for Friday. No details, no agenda, just the time and location. The tension built as Friday approached. Everyone wondered, what now? When Friday came, the staff gathered in the same conference room. This time, though, the energy was different. No nervous fidgeting, just anticipation mixed with unease. Then the door opened, and Jamal walked in, but he wasn't alone. Behind him were two people no one recognized, both professionally dressed, carrying notepads. Jamal didn't waste time with small talk. "Good morning," he began, his tone as calm as ever. "Today isn't just another meeting, it's an evaluation." The room went silent. "These are consultants," he continued, nodding toward the two strangers. "They've spent the past few weeks observing this branch, discreetly, of course. Their job was simple, to see if anything changed after our last conversation." Lisa shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her face pale. Mark's jaw clenched, but he stayed silent. Jamal continued, "But before we get to their feedback, I want to share something." He pulled out a folder and opened it, revealing several sheets of paper. "These are complaints," he said, holding them up. "Not from last month, not even from last year. These go back further. Some were overlooked, some dismissed, but they all have one thing in common: people feeling disrespected, ignored, or mistreated. He let that sink in. "This isn't about one bad day," Jamal said, his voice firm. "It's about a pattern." The consultants took turns speaking, sharing observations about subtle biases, microaggressions, and a general culture of favoritism that went beyond Lisa and Mark. The issues weren't just isolated to one or two employees. They were baked into the daily operations. The twist? Lisa wasn't the worst offender anymore. While suspended, she had time to reflect. Surprisingly, she'd taken that time seriously, enrolling in leadership courses and even volunteering in customer service roles elsewhere. Her growth was evident, though it didn't erase her past mistakes. But Mark, he hadn't changed. In fact, the consultants noted that his behavior had gotten worse. Without Lisa around, he'd felt untouchable, doubling down on his arrogance and treating others with even less respect. Jamal listened carefully, then turned to Lisa. "You made mistakes, big ones, but you've shown signs of growth. That doesn't mean you're off the hook, but it means there's hope for you." Lisa's eyes welled up, but she held back tears. She knew it wasn't forgiveness, but it was a chance. Then Jamal faced Mark. "You've had the same opportunity, but instead of learning, you proved exactly why change is necessary." The room was dead silent. "Effective immediately," Jamal said, his voice unwavering. "You're terminated." Mark didn't argue. He just sat there, stunned, as the reality hit him. Jamal turned back to the rest of the staff. "This isn't just about punishing bad behavior," he said. "It's about creating a culture where respect isn't optional." Then came the final twist. Jamal announced that he wasn't just an owner. He was stepping in as the interim regional director. He wouldn't just oversee this branch from afar. He'd be there day to day, observing, mentoring, and ensuring that the changes weren't temporary. The staff was speechless. Jamal smiled slightly. Surprised? Good. That's the point. Because real change doesn't come when people think they're being watched. It comes when they believe in what they're doing, even when no one's looking. Months passed after that final meeting, but the impact of Jamal's words didn't fade. The bank transformed, not just in policies, but in its people. The shiny floors and sleek glass walls were the same, but the energy felt different. This time, it wasn't just about appearances. It was about respect. Lisa returned to work after her suspension, but she wasn't the same person. The time away had forced her to confront the uncomfortable truth. She'd built her confidence on a foundation of arrogance. But instead of running from it, she faced it. She enrolled in leadership courses, sought mentorship, and even volunteered in community programs. Slowly, she rebuilt herself, not as the boss who gave orders, but as a leader who listened. Jamal noticed the change, but he didn't say much. He didn't need to. Growth speaks for itself. As for Mark, his story ended differently. He never came back after his termination. But his absence was its own lesson to the team about accountability, consequences, and the fact that not everyone chooses growth when given the chance. Jamal continued his role as the interim regional director longer than expected, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He walked the halls, not as a distant figure in a fancy office, but as someone present, engaged, and approachable. He'd sit with tellers during lunch breaks, ask about their families, and remind them, without saying it, that respect wasn't just for the people in suits. One day, during a staff appreciation event, Jamal stood before his team. No grand speeches, just simple words that hit harder than any corporate memo. Respect isn't a policy. It's a choice. Every day, with every person, you get to decide who you are based on how you treat others. Silence followed, not because people didn't care, but because they did. Later that evening, Lisa approached Jamal as he was leaving. "Mr. Thompson," she began, her voice steady but soft. "Jamal," he corrected with a slight smile. She nodded. "Jamal, I just wanted to say thank you. Not for giving me my job back, but for not letting me stay the person I was." Jamal studied her for a moment, then replied, "I didn't do that. You did." She smiled, genuinely this time. Not the forced, professional grin she used to wear, but one rooted in humility and growth. Walking to his car, Jamal reflected on everything. The day he walked into the bank dressed like just another customer felt like a lifetime ago. Back then, he'd been frustrated, disappointed, even angry. But now, he was grateful. Because that day wasn't just about exposing flaws in others. It was about realizing the power of presence, accountability, and quiet leadership. Jamal had always believed that success wasn't about titles or wealth. It was about impact. And sometimes, the greatest impact comes from the simplest actions: a conversation, a choice, a lesson learned the hard way. So, what's the takeaway from this story? It's not about being the boss. It's about how you treat people when you think no one's watching. Because character isn't revealed in grand gestures. It's found in the small moments, the quiet choices, the unseen acts of integrity. Sometimes, life teaches you lessons in the most unexpected ways. Jamal walked into his own bank, not expecting to change anyone's life. But that's exactly what happened. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to flex his authority. All he did was observe, stay calm, and let the truth reveal itself. Lisa thought her title made her untouchable. But she learned that respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn. Mark believed he could judge people based on appearances, but he discovered too late that the person you overlook today might be the one holding your future in their hands. Jamal's story isn't just about leadership. It's about how you treat people when you think no one's watching. Because the real test of character doesn't happen when the spotlight is on you. It happens in the small, unnoticed moments. Now let me ask you this. Have you ever been underestimated? Or judged unfairly because of how you looked? What did that experience teach you? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. If this story made you think, inspired you, or reminded you of the power of respect, don't forget to share and subscribe. Because sometimes the stories that matter most aren't about what people do when they're in charge. They're about who they are when no one's looking. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned, because the next story might just change the way you see the world.